Are orphanages the best way to help at-risk kids?
So the short answer is no, they're not. They appear to be the logical solution to when kids are separated from family care. Residential children's programming is not a bad option in a crisis situation.
I'm compelled to, because there's going to be people watching saying, wait, orphanages are where orphans live, right? And so it seems to me that you're saying many of these children are not actually orphans in the true definition of the word. Is that what you're getting at?
That's exactly right. Often these orphans have lost just one caregiver and actually do have a living parent. Even in cases where they don't, they often have grandparents or aunts and uncles or older siblings or family that could adopt them, as in your own case. Globally, there are about, I think now it's about 5 million children, 5.5 million children that live in residential institutional care, orphanages, children's homes, children's villages. And of those children, 80 to 90% of them have a living parent who could care for them if they were provided the support that they needed to do that.
Missions Pulse. Know God's heart, join His mission. This podcast is powered by Within Reach Global. Subscribe, watch, and listen on YouTube today. Visit missionspulse.com.
Welcome back to Missions Pulse. We encourage you to know God's heart and join His mission. If you've been around, watched any of these videos at all, I think you know that this is all about catching a heartbeat and a passion for what God cares about. And it's really quite simple if you think about it. What matters in life, you could boil it down to His kingdom and people. And I think those are the things that we're trying to inspire you to think even more about through your daily life. As you go through life, I know we're busy with so many different things. Some are positive, some perhaps negative, some things that just distract us, if you want to be honest. But the whole idea here is to really catch a heartbeat of God, see what He's doing around the world, all over the place, and kind of join His mission. If you like this content, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Really excited about this conversation today because it touches something very personal in my life, in my wife's life, as we've adopted a child from Thailand and gone through that entire journey of a number of years. And with me, joining me today as we talk about are orphanages the best way to help at-risk kids is Dr. Laura Horvath. And welcome to the show. It's great to have you on.
It's great to be on. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this conversation. I don't even know if you know that we did adopt. And so, this is something that is very, as I've spent time both on short-term, I was always on the receiving end. I was the contact for these short-term missions coming and often going to an orphanage or a children's home or something, but then walking through that journey of adopting our own child here in Thailand. So, I'm looking forward to this. I'm going to start off strong before you tell me a little bit about yourself. But what is this conversation about? Are orphanages the best way to help at-risk kids?
So the short answer is no, they're not. I think that they appear to be the logical solution to when kids are separated from family care. And orphanages are not, residential children's programming is not a bad option in a crisis situation. But we like to say that they should be of the shortest possible duration, and that children should be returned to family as quickly as they possibly can be. And we can talk about what that means too.
As you say that, I'm compelled to, because there's going to be people watching saying, wait, orphanages are where orphans live, right? And so it seems to me that you're saying many of these children are not actually orphans in the true definition of the word. Is that what you're getting at?
That's exactly right. And there are a couple of things that most people don't understand. About 20 or so years ago, UNICEF defined the word orphan as a child that has lost one or both caregivers. Now, if you ask anybody on the street what's an orphan, they'll say that's a child that doesn't have anyone who can care for them. But that isn't the case. Often these orphans have lost just one caregiver and actually do have a living parent. Even in cases where they don't, they often have grandparents or aunts and uncles or older siblings or family that could adopt them, as in your own case. And so there's that piece. The other thing is, we know globally there are about, I think now it's about 5 million children, 5.5 million children that live in residential institutional care, orphanages, children's homes, children's villages. And of those children, 80 to 90% of them have a living parent who could care for them, if they were provided the support that they needed to do that. And when we found that out, we used to have a residential orphanage. We had an orphanage in Sierra Leone, Africa for 16 years before we started that transition. We heard that statistic that 80 to 90% of orphans and orphanages have a parent. And we said, well, I wonder what it is for us. So we did our own research. We looked at our own program. And when we did the numbers, 98% of our kids had a living parent, 98%. That was
so obviously these families were struggling financially, economically, so it was a better solution for them to bring the child to the orphanage?
Yeah. Well, I think they think it's a better solution.
Okay.
So what happens in the global south is that you have governments and ministries and just contexts where basic social programming, access to education, access to healthcare is not provided by the government. Or not reliably provided by the government, or not financially supported by the government. And so parents actually make the heartbreaking decision to put their children in these orphanages to get them access to the things that they can't provide themselves. But when we did our transition, we could only ever care for about 40 kids in the orphanage at any given point in time, because we're constricted by the walls, right? You can only fit in how many people you can fit into the box. When we started moving kids into families and then providing families with just the minimal support they needed so that they could get their kids access to school or get their kids access to healthcare, that we were able to reach, compare this, 40 kids in the orphanage. We now support 450 families, and it's about the same budget.
No way. Really?
And those families get to stay intact. And those kids don't suffer the trauma of separation from the people who love and care for them.
Wow. Okay. That's the transition that I want to be picking up on during this time. And I know there's going to be people who probably don't get what we're saying. I mean, my daughter, her mother is still here in the city. However, at 2 weeks old, the birth mom gave up all rights to her child. And so she was able to be adopted. Different case. So there's going to be statements that we make. I think that people are going to put some comments on there like, well, that's not how it was for me. That's okay. I'm looking at big picture here, and I think that's what you're doing as well. But maybe you can help me zoom in a little bit onto ground level in some cases.
Yeah. So I think what you're talking about brings up a really important point. I mean, you can make this sound really simple, that what you need to do is just take the kids that are in the orphanage and return them back to their families. But we know that all families are not made equal, and that some families are not suitable for children, not just kids that are in orphanages, but, often kids in the community. There are families that, for various reasons, are not suitable places for kids. So the Child Reintegration Center, which is our Sierra Leone partner that Helping Children Worldwide supports in Sierra Leone, they work on what they call a continuum of care. So what they do is take every child as a separate case and look at what is the best placement for this child. And they do start with a biological parent if one's available. We sort of hearken to our biology. There's a certain kind of responsibility that we feel to people we're biologically connected to sometimes. And so that's a good place to start. But sometimes that biological placement isn't suitable. And so then we look at, is there an aunt or an uncle? Is there a grandparent? Is there maybe an older sibling who could take that child in and wants to take that child in and has the capacity to do that? And if not, is there someone in the community? Is there a domestic adoption option for this child? Is there an international adoption option for this child? And so, you take each case as it comes, each child as it comes, and what you're looking for is what is the best, most loving, safest, permanent placement for that child, with the goal always being family, but expanding the notion of what family can mean, right?
I like that. I like how you're zooming into the family as maybe the spear tip. As you keep mentioning Sierra Leone. Still, we haven't even told your background and how you've come into this deep passion. But still, I want to kind of linger here because you keep mentioning Sierra Leone. I found this on the website. We can play it here right now, and there's no sound to it, but your mic is hot. Can you walk us through some of these stats, the data, and the heart behind what is taking place in Sierra Leone as an example?
Yeah, sure. So we started in Sierra Leone in the year 2000, coming out of an 11-year civil war. It blew the infrastructure apart. It separated families and scattered them to the four winds. And we did what most Christians do. We said, well, we can build an orphanage, and we can make these kids safe, and we can get them access to things. Sierra Leone is one of the poorest countries, continues to be one of the poorest countries in the world, hovers at the bottom of every index. That you can find in terms of just poverty. And it's a place where orphanages are frequently seen as the answer because people live on less than $1.25 a day. And so they really are extraordinarily impoverished. And what we know from the research is that most families become separated because of poverty. It's not because there isn't anyone that can care for these kids, it's that they can't afford to. So that's why we started it was then called the Child Rescue Center, and it was an orphanage for about 16 years. And then we transitioned it. And now the CRC is called the Child Reintegration Center, and it reintegrates street-connected children back into family care. And as I said, sometimes it's a biological family, sometimes kinship, sometimes adoptive. In addition, the Child Reintegration Center provides family strengthening. So, we don't want to create dependencies where families are just dependent on us for support. We want to empower them. And so there are things, you probably saw the picture go by about microfinance. There's microfinance training and microfinance loans that we give out. There's parenting training that we offer. HCW also supports an on-site hospital called Mercy Hospital. Sierra Leone continues to be at the bottom of the infant maternal mortality rate, or at the top of that in the world. And so we focus on infant maternal mortality and nutrition supports, and that also strengthens families. And it gives us the opportunity to give access to healthcare at our own hospital to those families that are in the Child Reintegration Center programming. We're looking now to empower whole villages, and build their capacity so that that village could then provide the social services the village needs without support from us. So access to education and things like that through a community enterprise, like a community garden where everybody in the village benefits from the profits of that garden, for example.
Awesome. It sounds like you've done this before. I mean, I can immediately sense that you're not stumbling over words, and I can sense your passion and your deep heart. Let me ask you this before you tell me your story. What is the end result that you would like to see through helping children worldwide or even personally?
Yeah. So this might surprise you, but the end result for me is that I'm no longer needed. The end result for me is that I've worked myself out of a job. That families are intact, that families are empowered to care for themselves and to care well for their children, to access the resources they need to be resilient. We're not trying to make everyone in Sierra Leone have a middle-class life or whatever, but we want families to become resilient so they can withstand the kind of normal shocks that life brings you without needing support. So they're not on the brink of vulnerability. I'm trying to work myself out of a job.
Love that idea. I share that with you. I often say that exact same phrase here within Reach Global as I serve among the unreached. And I'm so happy to hear that you have that heart because, and maybe we'll get into it, the white savior complex or just simply the savior complex. But here we are 13 minutes into Missions Pulse, and I haven't even heard your story. So let's back up a little bit. And you're talking like someone so passionate about at-risk or vulnerable children globally. What led to this point? Can you give us a little catch-up of what's taken place in your life?
Yeah, I can try. So I started as a high school English teacher and then a college professor. And that was the path. That was the goal. My PhD is actually in curriculum and instruction. And I was teaching at the university. I was teaching in a high school. And I attended a missions presentation at my local church. And this is a church I selected because of its high mission focus, its high value around missions. And there was a presentation about a recent trip to this orphanage in Sierra Leone, Africa, and pictures on screen. What I remember vividly was a classroom full of kids, sitting 3 to a desk, probably about 100 kids in a classroom that should have had about maybe 30. And at the end during the Q&A, I raised my hand and I said, what could somebody do to help support, this orphanage or what's happening there, who's never, ever, ever going to Africa ever? And the pastor looked at me and he said, you're going to regret asking that question. And I've told him many times since then, I haven't ever regretted it, not once. But I got involved as a volunteer to help support the academics of the kids living in the orphanage. And I traveled over on my first trip and a couple trips after that to teach summer school to the kids in the orphanage. I came over with a team of American teachers. We had access to kids all day long, teaching them reading and math primarily. My first trip, I was teaching Julius Caesar to high school age.
Wow.
How ridiculous. And like all the way to the evening, we, sang songs and read Bible scriptures and books and helped put kids to bed and did all the things that now make me sort of cringe. But we didn't know. And then over the years, as we learned a better way, as we learned what kids really need, I'm really proud to have helped our partners in Sierra Leone, have worked in partnership with them closely to transition this model, not just of how kids are cared for and where they live, this shift from residential care to family-based care, but how we do missions, how we prepare mission teams and what they do when we send them over. That's very different than what it used to be. And I think along the way, what I learned is that this is my calling. This is my purpose for being on the planet. And I hesitate to use that word, but I think when you talk about hearing the passion in my voice or whatever, that's because that's why. Is because I believe that my purpose for being here on the earth is to see that as many kids find their way home to family as I possibly can in whatever way I can do that.
That's powerful. And it leads me into this next idea about short-term mission trips and why you zero in on that. But I'm hearing that you tell me that this is your ultimate passion and your purpose. Why? Why is this? Are you, as you say that, are you thinking of a little face? Are you thinking of these eyes that are looking back at you? Is it, who are these kids that they have become to mean so much to you? And if to you, what do they mean to the heart of God?
Right. So it's an awesome responsibility, right? When you take on a mission that's focused on children, you are literally taking responsibility for the most vulnerable group of people on the planet. There's nobody more vulnerable than a child that's separated from family care. That's the very different definition of vulnerability. And I think I don't really see a particular like child's face or group of children's faces when I think about this. I will say that being a mom, I'm a parent. I have 3 kids. They're quite a bit older now. But I think when you become a parent, you begin to understand the heart of God as a father, as a parent, better. I know you know that as a parent. And what I realized as we were embarking on this transition is that as good as the Child Rescue Center was, and the Child Rescue Center was known as a model, as a center of excellence in the country, and we were quite proud of it. And I think had good reason to be for various reasons anyway. But what I realized is that if something were to happen to me and my husband, I wouldn't want my kids to go there. I wouldn't want my kids to wind up there. I would want them to be with my sister or my sister-in-law or my girlfriend from, that I've known for 30 years, because I want my children to know and be loved and be seen for who they are. And that just isn't possible in an institutional setting in the way that it is in family. And I think every parent wants that for their children. And it's heartbreaking to me. I think maybe if there are faces that I see, it's these mothers and fathers. We have a father in the program who's handicapped, who put his children in the orphanage because he couldn't provide for them, and how heartbroken he was to have to do that. I witnessed him coming to visit them. He would save his money so that he could get someone to bring him and his wheelchair to the orphanage so he could visit his children. And when it was time for him to go home and they were going to be separated again, it just ripped their hearts out, because every parent wants to be with their child. Every child wants to be with their parent. And kids don't care if their parents are poor. I mean, certainly they care if they have access to enough food to eat. And those are things we can provide. Those are things we can help families get access to.
Yeah.
If you ask any child in any orphanage anywhere what they want more than anything, it's a family of their own.
Yeah. As you share, my goodness, I just can't help but thinking of the journey to meeting Eliana, my daughter, Eliana Pariagon. Birth mom gave her the name Pariagon. It's the only thing she gave her and left her. And so we wanted to keep that name. I remember picking her up, first meeting her when she was 1.5 years old. And she was one of 102 children at an orphanage here in Chiang Mai. And we were placed with her and matched with her, and our hearts were alive. We literally lived 10 or 12 minutes away from her, and we'd go visit her every week. Sometimes they would ask us to come every 2 weeks. And it was this very strange journey. And the more I was there, I came to love her. There would be different short-term mission teams. And there was this one Swedish girl who would always come. And there's my daughter with this other person who she won't be with long. And soon she'll come to me. It was such a very strange feeling. And until she finally came and joined us. And now, I mean, she is my daughter. My part of me. And yes, I cannot imagine her going back and living in that orphanage. It's a great place. The people are wonderful. And we even go back on her birthdays and we, give away milk and cookies and have we're very open with her about her story as much as we should be at age 4. But at age 5, next month, we're going to do the same thing and go, bless all these little children. But never is she going to go live there again. So I totally resonate with that man and countless others who you describe. Yeah. As you're talking about short-term missions, this has been a hot thing to do in the missions world for quite some time, right? Yeah, there's a word for it. Is it like orphanage mission trips, or there's a better phrase for it? I can't recall.
Well, so I've heard it. I've heard the term orphanage tourism or orphan tourism. That's the one being kind of bandied about. Yeah. Most recently. Maybe different than mission trips, because that's tourism, but there is striking similarities to a short-term impact that you can have. It's very much for you. It's very moving for that individual. How is it helpful or hurtful to the children to have these people come in for short stints at the time and then leave them again? Yeah. So the research is really clear that it re-traumatizes children who already have suffered a separation trauma. And we learned this lesson really well. This is one of those situations where something really horrible can be redeemed. We had an Ebola outbreak in West Africa. I want to say... I was probably 2018. Is that right?
Yes,
anyway, Ebola outbreak. And we had at the time been sending about 4 mission teams a year. And one of them was an orphan missions, group, or maybe 2 of them were orphan missions in terms of having a lot of access to kids in the orphanage. And then when the outbreak happened, we stopped sending teams for about a year. I was on the first team that went back after the Ebola outbreak was over. We sent a team of folks that had been over many times just to kind of see how things were, get the lay of the land and all of that. And we were just starting to understand the trauma, the separation trauma that happens with short-term mission teams. And I remember I was sitting on the side of the football pitch at the orphanage and watching the kids play. And 2 little girls got in a fight, an argument over the ball or something, I'm not really sure. And I physically braced myself sitting there on the bench, because what I knew would happen is they would run and jump on my lap and look for justice and mercy and kindness and, all of the things. Because that's what I've come to expect when I'd arrived on mission trips. They ran right past me and into the arms of the auntie that was their assigned caregiver. And I realized that I was having the moment I would have on a playground in the United States. If I saw two children that were not related to me having a fight, they wouldn't run into my arms for comfort and justice. They would run into the arms of their caregiver or their parent because that's what's appropriate. And I thought, oh, this is how it's meant to be. Because we hadn't been over in a year, those children had had the time to form attachments, longer term attachments to the caregivers in the orphanage, which was better, not there yet, but better. And what we had been doing with short-term mission teams is going over, and kids that have suffered a separation trauma will attach very quickly to anybody that offers them care and attention and love and all of that. And so when you visit an orphanage, kids will often run to you immediately, want to be held, want their hand held, want to be cuddled. They're constantly looking for physical affection. And what we understand now is that's a sign of trauma. I mean, you think about your own daughter, you don't want her running into the arms of a stranger. We teach them not to do that. And when they're attached well to you, they won't do that because they'll look to you for that comfort. But kids in orphanages don't know who to look to. And so they look to anyone that they can attach to. And so short-term missioners feel great about that because kids, are affectionate and loving and whatever. And then after 2 weeks, they get on the plane and they go home and they separate, they cause a separation trauma for those kids. The kids attach really quickly and then that attachment is broken. And then the next team comes and they attach really quickly and then that attachment is broken. And that's sort of the bad news, I guess. The good news is when you start reintegrating children into family or reunifying children into family, that connection, that trauma gets healed. So there is trauma. I mean, when kids are separated from parental care, there is a trauma, but that trauma can be healed, but only by family. So that's why we're focused on it that way.
So it could only be healed by the family. Is it a Band-Aid? A quick fix? Is it more helpful to the person visiting than to the actual child to have? I mean, because you're going to be speaking to these organizations that exist for this very purpose, right? They're sending teams. Yeah. So are we saying that, no, we don't want that? We don't want your short-term teams anymore. Is this the healthy thing? I know we're speaking in broad blanket statements, and maybe that's not fair, but in general, at large, are we saying that this is not healthy or helpful and the locals can do it better? The caregivers in the orphanage can do it better, or we're working towards a long-term goal to get this child into a family. But what if we're not? What if that orphanage is not? Where does it leave those children? Again, you have to think of that child, right? And what is the best case for them?
So I think there's maybe good news and bad news here. I think, it's better for the locals to lead. It's better, we're big at HCW, we're big proponents of local solutions for local problems and local leadership to solve those problems. What we started to realize as we were making this transition, and we still had kids in the orphanage, was that the best way to care for a child is to care for the caregiver. When we had an orphanage, that was the orphanage staff. And so we started shifting our mission focus to, okay, let's stop doing so much intensive focus where missioners come from far away and they focus all this attention and energy on the children in front of them and then cause this separation trauma when they leave. Let's instead have mission teams that come over and build the capacity of the caregivers in the orphanage, that focus on how to help them and support them and the caregiving work that they're doing 24 hours a day, 365 days of the year, and not just for this 2-week period where a mission team is on the ground. How can we best support them? Because that impacting them is going to have a better impact on the children long term. And it means shifting as a missioner that your focus for me, I guess I'll speak personally. I felt more in service. I felt more as a servant in supporting the people on the ground that were doing this job all the time, and not just for 2 weeks while I was there. And it helped me to sort of promote them as the hero in the children's story, as the champions of care for these kids. And I've developed.
What did that mean? Did that mean when the child's running to you and comes into your lap that you kind of push them over to the caregiver? I mean, what does it
Well,
look
so
like in
think
real
about it,
life?
like if you were a camp counselor, like at a church camp or something, and you were serving as a camp counselor, you're not becoming that child's de facto parent or caregiver. But you're obviously gonna provide some level of care, right? Or if a neighborhood
Yeah.
child would run to me, skin their knee, or a kid fell off their bike behind my house once, and I went out and kind of patched him up and got him a drink and a Band-Aid, and then walked him to his parent. And so it's that kind of thing. And what we would tell
Yeah.
mission teams is, something like this happens, give a squeeze or whatever, and then say, let's go find Auntie Mabel. Let's you and I together, we'll go find your auntie, and your auntie will take care of this. And then you do that handoff so that Auntie Mabel gets to be the person that's, saving the day or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I like how you are painting this in a way that I've heard this story and the nuances of it told many, many times, but I like how you're describing it in a way that is so, it's for the layman, and I'll consider myself a layman because, you're not going to let that kid just bleed out there on the street, even though he fell off his bike. And I like that transition into maybe being the guide rather than the hero. Is this something that is possible? This transition, is it possible for orphanages at large? And maybe you could walk us through, how did this transition for you at Helping Children Worldwide actually take place?
Well, a couple things. We had some incidences in the orphanage of abuse. Even in a really good orphanage, that happens. It's very, very common. And that alarmed us, and we did all the things. We put all the safeguards in place and what have you. But then we started talking with social workers here in the U.S. who said, yeah, that's really common in an institutional setting. And when we said, well, what's the solution? They said, don't have an institutional setting. So that was difficult to hear.
Mm-hmm.
We started doing all of the research into the impacts of growing up in orphanages versus growing up in families, and the outcomes are not good. And that certainly wasn't what we wanted for the children we felt like God had put before us to provide the best care we possibly could. And then the most compelling reason for us, or the most compelling kind of argument, is that I met a young man at the orphanage back in 2006. He was probably 10 or 11 at the time. Saw him many years over many trips to the orphanage. He grew up completely in the orphanage care, aged out. We sent him to college. He came back and became the orphanage director.
Wow.
And
Okay.
he's now on Helping Children Worldwide staff. His name is Emmanuel
That's
Nabu. And we have become very good friends, and we had become very good friends when I was on staff at HCW and he was running the orphanage. And we started having this conversation about what it was like for him to grow up in an orphanage. He had found his mom subsequently and was trying to build a relationship with her after many, many years, and is still trying. And he was very frank about both the positives and the negatives of growing up in institutional care and not ever having that family connection. And we started talking about, what would it mean? What would it look like if we closed the orphanage? And at first, it was all options on the table, including just closing the orphanage. And then we realized we could actually transition it. We could actually get kids back home and then strengthen those families and support those families to care for their own children. And then we could keep doing that work, because there are 76,000 street-connected kids in Sierra Leone. We could find some of those street-connected kids and begin to reconnect them back to family. And then in 2019, we started talking, plugging into global networks like the Christian Alliance for Orphans and Faith to Action and World Without Orphans, and realizing that orphanages all over the world were doing this transition and are now teaching other orphanages how to do the same. So Child Reintegration Center now has a transition coaching and mentoring department that works with orphanages and residential children care centers to embark on and do their own transition to this family care model. So yeah, it's not only possible, it's happening. And there are organizations that we're connected to all over the world that are training other orphanages how to follow this path and reintegrate children back into families, and then impact many, many more families. As I said, we had 40 kids in the orphanage. We now have 450 families. And as those families graduate and come off of our support, we'll be able to help even more, so that the impact of how many people we're able to reach, it just expands.
So the good news is that this transition does open up into a multiplicative kind of blessing, perhaps broader and larger than an orphanage or institution would. Can I ask you, how long has it been? Do we have orphanages in America? And if not, when was that transition taken place? I mean, when did we go from that institution into more foster care and other alternatives?
Yeah. That is a really interesting question because we don't really have orphanages. Now you'll have like youth homes and things like that, but they tend to be more for, sort of judicial criminal situations or things like that. And we do have more of a foster care model, and we could talk for, days about the brokenness of American foster care system.
Sure.
Like that. It's certainly not a perfect system, but it is interesting that, that we don't have orphanages in the Western Hemisphere the way that we do in the global South. And what's even more interesting about that is that in the continent of Africa, particularly, I can't speak to the entire global South, but in Africa, orphanages are not an African construct. They're a transport. They're something that Western, supporters brought over as a solution to the problem. And so
missionaries.
Yeah, a lot. I mean, I think the vast majority of orphanages and residential care models in the global South do have a Christian kind of connection. So, and that's not to bang on the Christians at all, because look, for centuries when nobody else would step in and care for these kids, Christians have done that. I mean, it's part of it's the James 1:27 calling. We take that very seriously, and so I'm not ever gonna bash on anybody for starting an orphanage, but what I want to do is help people understand how your impact and the outcomes for kids can be so much better if you think outside the box, if you can think of ways to help kids that are outside of the box of an orphanage, because, an orphanage is limited. When we literally started thinking outside of our box, we're now impacting families. And when you're impacting families, you're impacting entire communities. So you just got to break down the walls.
I see you as that glass half full kind of person, and I love the encouragement you're giving. I also don't ever want to throw missionaries under the bus. We talk regularly about the struggles and difficulties and attrition and the things that are taking place in the missions world. But yes, that James 1:27 calling, it is kind of the underpinning of so much that missionaries who are focused on at-risk kids specifically do. So I love that. But there is something better. There's something broader. And I think this is something we need to look at in every field.
Exactly. And I think, missioners and Christians that get into this work, like that's coming from such a godly place. Yeah. Such a loving place that, of course, I mean, this is how I felt about it. One of the things I love about HCW is we're what I call a know better, do better organization. And what I mean is we try to do the very best we can to do for the kids that we think are put in and families now that are put into our care. But when we know there's a better way, we want to do that better way. We want to pivot to that. We want to always be called to the higher. And so, I think you don't get into this work without wanting to do it well. And so if we can empower people with tools to do it even better than they're doing it now, and people can embrace that and move in that direction, then that's what we want to do.
Yeah, that's excellent. You keep saying the word missioners. Why don't you say missionaries? I'm just wondering.
I don't know. That's an HCW term that we use. Maybe because when we talk about our missioners, they're short-term mission. They're there for 2 weeks at a period of time. We have a long-term mission of 22 years now, almost 23 years with our partners in Sierra Leone. And so the mission I think of is this 23-year partnership relationship that we have with them that's evolved over time, with certainly a lot more white colonialistic in the early days than it is now. But this deep, deep connection and relationship that we have with them, that's this 22-year mission. And I think when we send short-term mission teams over, what I want is for them to understand that their 2 weeks in the context of 22 years is a moment. And I think sometimes when missioners travel, short-term missioners travel, I'm using the word again.
That's fine. It's intriguing. I never really hear people use the word. And I like it because it takes away some of the negative or pejorative connotations around the word missionary.
Okay, good. Anyway, but yeah, what I want them to understand, and not to put them down in any way, but just
Sure.
the impact you're going to have within this mission in just 14 days.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess have some humility about that.
Absolutely. And I think that's spoken at large to any field. If you move outside of the orphanage or institution or at-risk vulnerable children, to any field. We serve specifically among unreached. We do children's ministry heavily. But if you don't come in that posture of a learner in that short 2 weeks, nobody wants to be a big part of a small thing. They want to be a small part of a big thing. And those who want to be a big part of a small thing, I'm not really interested in hosting you for those 2 weeks because it's too much work. I know you're not coming as a learner.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. I always try to put myself like in my partner's shoes. Like if the CRC staff, if somebody would, come over on a mission trip to us here in Virginia, and spend 2 weeks looking over my shoulder and telling me how to do my job better, I might have some feelings about that, That's
the argument I often hear. You just said there was a conference you said a while ago. Can you name that again? No.
The Christian Alliance for Orphans. Or
the other one.
World Without Orphans.
Yes, World Without Orphans.
Yes.
Actually, we went to a conference here in Chiang Mai, Thailand, 2019, just before COVID, maybe 2018.
Emmanuel Manabu was there, actually.
Oh, was he? Okay. I met a bunch of people there. I was wondering, maybe you would even know them. Let's see, Rebecca Knepp.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we work closely with Better Care Network and Rebecca. She's excellent.
I see. Okay. Very cool. Yeah. I had her on the show. And then Krish Kendaya.
Yes. He was with Homes. He's moved on now, but he was with Hope and Homes.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, cool. Okay, yeah. When you said that, I was just there briefly and met a number of people and had these kind of conversations. I also met a woman named Sunny Gitonga. She's from Kenya, and oh my goodness, I'm sorry, Sunny, I can't recall the name of her organization, but she was talking about dispelling the negative connotations of the word orphan, of which she was, and just reiterating that it was someone who doesn't have a mom or dad. She told me that very clearly. And removing that sad state of events. I know there are great difficulty around being an orphan, but the reality is they're just someone in need of a family. And I think that's the whole gist.
This has occurred to me recently, but when there is a child in an orphanage, they're an orphan. That's their identity, right?
Yeah.
They don't have parents on the outside, but in the orphanage, they're an orphan. To the community, they're an orphan. When you reintegrate a child back into family, suddenly now they're a granddaughter or a grandson, or they're a son or daughter, or they're a niece or nephew, or they're a member of the family. They're a member
in the eyes of the community.
In the eyes of the community, and your daughter is your daughter. She's not an orphan.
No,
she's your daughter. She's a member of your family, and that's. I think every kid deserves that.
Have you found the kind of a richerness of the gospel and this grand adoption into the biggerness of the family of God, the kingdom of God? This great king goes out and adopts strays and homeless. And this is, as Eliana has come into our life, I have come to see my own adoption, that I was once homeless, that I was once on the outside. It's brought adoption into such a powerful, positive light in our family. We talk about it we're so open with her because we see it in such a positive, not negative light.
Yeah. No, I think that's 100% true. So the James 1:27 verse talks about caring for the widow and the orphan. My pastor did a sermon series once on how sometimes the smallest word is the most important word. And so I kind of keyed in on that word and. He doesn't say care for the widow or care for the orphan. He says care for the widow and the orphan. And it strikes me that most of the families that CRC now supports or is empowering are female-headed households. They're literally widows and orphans. And I think that God meant for those to be cared for together. And then there's the scripture, and I can't remember now. God sets the lonely in families. Look, he gave us the model. He gave us the model. God set the lonely in families. He didn't set them in orphanages. He didn't set them in institutions. He set them into families. He's saying, this is what I need you to do. And then my favorite verse is Micah 6:8. Just why I'm wearing my t-shirt. We know the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child talks about how every child has the right to know the love of family and be cared for by family. That's the just solution. That's justice for children, is that they grow up in families. So I do think that, and it strikes me too that, like, what was Joseph but a foster dad or an adoptive dad for Jesus? I think there's so much in that you can understand, not just God's heart for his children, but God's heart for the vulnerable children and the children that are separated from care and the children that are orphaned. And I think he's really clear about how he wants us to care for them.
Absolutely. Hearing you talk, it doesn't take much to pull out your passion. And you're speaking in terms, again, for the layperson. I think you being in this field, I'll call it a field, for so long, myself being on the journey of becoming an adoptive dad only for 4 years now, a year and a half before Eliana came to live with us, almost 2.5 years since she's been with us, and just over a year since our adoption was finalized. These things are finally coming to the light, and I'm 44 years old. I'm a slow learner, I guess. But I never noticed the adoption, the great adoption thread throughout the Bible, this tapestry woven with threads all throughout from beginning to end, as I think many people don't even recognize the gospel, starting in Genesis, ending in Revelation. It's so easy to get sidetracked with all these little one-liners that we pull out of the Bible, stick up over our toilet, and read every once in a while as, little encouragement pops. And but this thread is woven throughout the entire Bible. Have you seen this, come to know it more and more? Is it just so natural that you forget and you think this is the gospel now, the great adoption?
No, it's a deeper understanding, like more and more, and the work pulls you deeper, and well, the Bible does that too, right? I mean, you can read, like you said, you can read that little encouragement pop or whatever, but that's why you continue to read scripture, is to, I see something different in it now. I mean, how many years had I read the, care for widow and the widow and the orphan, and thought I understood what it meant, and then just it's probably been three years ago, kind of keying in on the word "and." I didn't see that before. Yeah, it's just deeper understanding, and I think the working with vulnerable families, working with this man in the wheelchair who put his kids in the orphanage because it was literally all he could think to do to get them enough to eat, and then now seeing them reunited and understanding just the profound depth of love that they have for each other, and how we were focused on meeting critical and important and obvious needs, but overlooking maybe what was the most important need. So.
Now you've written extensively, I think, and I've seen different articles. I know there was something on religionnews.com. People can, I think, just go to religionnews.com, search your name. The full link will be in the description of this video on YouTube. Where else can people follow you, learn more? I know they've been seeing that little hashtag and handles of helping children worldwide. Where else can they hear your heart for these things?
Well, there's a piece out in Christian Post on a United Methodist campaign launch we just did called "A Strong Family for Every Child" that we're trying to get the entire denomination to embrace. So that's a good piece to kind of go out and look for. I'm also a co-host on the Optimistic Voices podcast, which covers global health missions and child welfare topics like the one we talked about today. And you can find that on the Helping Children Worldwide website as well. And then you can always find my contact information on HCW. This is literally my favorite thing in the world to talk about. My husband will tell you. And so, feel free to email me or follow me on Twitter, Facebook. I'm a little on Instagram. I'm a little bit older than you are, David, so my social media is probably not as savvy as you. But
I'm 44 and I'm a Gen Xer, so yeah. I'm an Xennial, right in between the millennials. So I kind of know how to tinker around, but I don't do reels well enough like a Gen Xer, Anyway, we digress. Yeah. I wanted to ask you this because I asked how people can contact you, and that wasn't the end of this conversation. I'm wondering what it is. My president here at Within Reach Global, Jacob Smith, and I often talk. We're both in our 40s. We've gone through our midlife crisis. We're probably still in it. I don't know. We talk often not so much about the legacy that we want to leave behind, because we very much share that same passion that you mentioned at the beginning of this, working ourselves out of a job, moving off to out of the limelight and seeing our indigenous leaders rise up. And those are the unsung heroes that in China for many times can't even show their faces or mention their names. Right. But we're talking more about setting something in motion. What is something that you just so passionately want to set in motion and see live beyond? That's getting at legacy as well. What is the legacy and something you want to set in motion in your lifetime?
Well, I hope what I've helped to do is set in motion this notion that every child can know family, that it's possible for every child to know family, to grow up and be loved and cared for by family. I think this movement, this is certainly not my movement. I certainly didn't prompt it, didn't start it. I'm not, a huge player in it. I play my small part. Ellie Oswald at Faith to Action sometimes uses this metaphor of that, the train has left the building. This transition of residential care models, of orphanages to family care models is already underway. It's been underway for 30 years. And it would be amazing to me if Christians would be sort of the headlight on the front of that train. Ellie says that too. I'm stealing that from Ellie, so I got to give her credit. But if Christians would be the headlight, if they would be the beacon for that, to help people who are sort of outside orphan missions and don't really know about orphanages and orphans and understand all of that. But if Christians could lead the way, as they have done in orphan missions and orphan care for centuries, literally centuries. So if I just play a very small part in that movement, and more kids get home to families, I'm going to feel like I had a life well lived. That's
awesome. As you were sharing, I remember my journey was a slow one. My wife and I tried to have a biological child for almost 10 years. We were serving in China and just could not have a child for so long. Wondering why, and we finally, after many, many years, went to the Philippines. My wife was diagnosed with endometriosis, stage 4. It was the worst case. Our doctor, who's known as the Lolo, or grandfather of endometriosis in the Philippines, said worst case he'd seen in 25 years of his practice. After 10 years, we finally gave birth. Well, my wife did. I was kind of there for the ride. I didn't do a whole lot. But Cara Liana came along, and she was our miracle baby, and she still is. But we'd always talk about, even before we had Cara, we'd go to many different orphanages in the Philippines, in China. We'd think, do we want to adopt? Is this something we want to do? And my wife did. And I wasn't quite sold on the idea. But then one time I was writing a book. I was off on a writing getaway. And I was writing, it's called The Space Between Memories, my first book. And in the background, I had an IHOP, International House of Prayer, from Kansas City playing. They have a 24-hour worship and prayer. And somebody gets up yelling and screaming on the TV behind me as I'm trying to focus on my writing, on my book, saying, calling out for father hearts, hearts for the orphans, men who will adopt children. And I suddenly broke down in tears. I have no idea what it was. And that was the moment after that writing getaway. I went back to my wife and said, do you want to adopt? Let's adopt. And she's like, okay, you're a little slow, but She pretended like it was my idea. And I know the reality in retrospect. And that's what led us on this journey. And here we are many years later. Perhaps there's people out there who not only love and care for kids and want to do a trip because their hearts are full of gracious love for children, as that James 1:27 passage states. If people want to adopt or move into that arena, what is your advice for beginning that journey for them?
If they want to adopt?
Yeah.
Wow, we don't do a lot of that work except domestically.
I see.
Yeah, I think for me, the bottom line is that every child needs to know and love family. And that can look really differently in lots of different places. Yeah. I think as far as adoption goes, I don't, my children are all biological, so I'm a little bit outside. But my friends that have adopted talk about the importance of open adoption, where that's possible, and having children be able to connect to their roots if that's possible at all. And Emmanuel actually helps me to understand the importance of that. I watched my colleague Emmanuel, who grew up in the orphanage, now has a relationship with his mother and his extended family, including a brother and a stepbrother. And he's navigating those relationships as best he can. He and his mother don't even speak the same language. He has to speak to his mother through an interpreter. Wow. But this deep need that he has to connect to these people that are his roots, to connect to these people that he didn't know for 20 some years, weren't in his life because of the situation. But he still has this deep longing to connect to them. And that's somehow part of his identity. And I'll be honest, I struggle sometimes to understand that as deep, in the way that he is trying to express it. And then the other thing that strikes me about adoption is when we had kids in the orphanage and the caregivers loved them, they truly did. We had aunties that were assigned to about 10 groups at a time, sort of children's village style. That's kind of a model. And they cared really deeply for those kids, but they would talk sometimes with me about, my own kids. And they were talking about their own children outside the orphanage. And it struck me that there was this kind of line of demarcation between the kids they were caring for in the orphanage, that we were trying to make them feel like we're sort of a family. But they had a different sense of, but my real family outside the walls. So I think, what's important in adoption is that child becomes fully and completely and 100% yours, that there's not a line of demarcation. That I heard a speaker once talk about adoption as an engrafting, like when you graft a different species of plant onto the trunk of of an existing plant, and that branch becomes a part of that tree. They're fully engrafted onto that tree. They're not just, stuck on with glue or duct tape or whatever. They are fully become a part of that. And so I think that's, again, I'm back to this sense of it can happen in so many different ways, but what the bottom line is, the kids need family.
Yeah. Yeah. I love I immediately sensed how you brought it back to family, the broader sense, or reuniting, whatever it may look like. Thank you so much for sharing all these deep, passionate thoughts that I think many more people need to gravitate to, catch a vision, really catch the pulse of the heart of Jesus for people, especially those who are vulnerable and at risk. It's amazing how much he talks about leaving the 99. They're safe, tucked away for a time for the ones. And like Heidi Baker always says, stop for that one. So, Laura, thank you so much for taking the time today. And I pray that more and more people catch this vision, passion that I think is evident in your life.
Thank you, David. I really appreciate you having me on.
Thank you. All right. Well, I just wanted to say, if you've been watching and hearing Laura's heart, and maybe there's something stirring in your heart, in your spirit, definitely get in touch with her, and she would love to share more about her journey. And I know there's something more for you as well. This is truly the heart of God. It's funny how simple Revelation makes it when he said, it was you who visited me when I was in prison, when I was homeless, when I was sick, when I was naked, when I was poor. And we said, no, Lord, we never saw you like that. And he said, what you did for the least of these, surely you did unto me. And then the grand welcome into his kingdom. This is the epicenter, the vulnerability, the hurt, those who are suffering. This is the epicenter of God's love. So I would encourage you to really think on that today. I pray that you're blessed by this conversation and join us next time. Have a wonderful day.
Missions Pulse. Know God's heart, join his mission. This podcast is powered by Within Reach Global. Subscribe, watch, and listen on YouTube today. Visit missionspulse.com.